Let's talk about per-device mappings in HID Remapper and how you can use them to assign different functions to two identical or similar devices plugged into HID Remapper. Normally, when you create a mapping in HID Remapper configuration, it applies to all devices that are plugged in. For example, here I have two identical USB joysticks, and I have plugged both into the same HID Remapper. They're actually analog joysticks that I have adapted to USB, but for the purpose of this demonstration, they're USB devices like any other. And of course, everything I say applies to other types of devices. It would work the same if I were to connect two mice or two keyboards. And this is a variant of HID Remapper with a built-in USB hub. But of course, if you have a DIY HID Remapper with an external USB hub plugged into it, it would all work the same as well. Okay. Because I set the emulated device type here to switch gamepad, the joysticks are already both working as the left analog stick. This is because I have the unmapped inputs pass-through setting enabled. But let's create an explicit mapping so that it's clear what we're doing later. I will disable the pass-through setting, and I will create two mappings. One that maps left stick X to itself and one that maps left stick Y to itself. On the input side, they're actually called cursor X and cursor Y, because internally the same input codes are used for mouse cursor movement and for the first stick on a joystick. Save the configuration. And of course, this works the same as before. Both sticks still work as the left analog stick. What if you want one of the joysticks to be the left stick and the other to be the right stick? That's what per-device mappings are for. When you click the button in the input column on a mapping, and you get this screen where you can choose what input you want to map, there's also this drop-down at the top labeled port. If I set it to, say, port 1, and close this pop-up, we can see that my mapping now has a small number 1 next to the input. This means that this mapping only applies to the device that's plugged into port 1. Because I keep saying per device mappings, but they're actually per port mappings. So we could create one set of mappings with the port set to 1, and another set of mappings with the port set to 2. And then each set of mappings would only apply to the device that's plugged into that port, allowing us to assign different functions to the devices. How do we know which port is which? We can use the Monitor tab for that. Normally, the Monitor tab shows you what inputs a device is sending to HID Remapper. But when you have a USB hub plugged in, or you're using a variant of HID Remapper that has a USB hub built in, it also shows you the port that the device is plugged into. When I move this joystick, it's showing the inputs with the little 1 next to them, because this joystick is plugged into port 1. The other joystick shows inputs with the little 2, because it's plugged into port 2. I can use this information to make the joystick work the way I want. Let's go back to the Mappings tab. We now know that we want the joystick plugged into port 1 to be the right stick. Let's set the port on the other mapping. And let's set the outputs to right stick. And I will create another set of mappings for the other joystick. I will set the port to 2. And I will set the output of the mapping to left stick X. And left stick Y. Again, cursor X and cursor Y is just what these inputs are called on the input side, but if you hover the cursor over the buttons, they're the same codes as left stick X and left stick Y. Okay, save this configuration. Now one of the joysticks works as the left stick, and the other works as the right stick. Success. They work like that because these two mappings only apply to the device that's plugged into port 1, and these two mappings only apply to the device that's plugged into port 2. And of course, you can use it for devices other than joysticks. Anytime you have two or more devices that are sending the same inputs and you want them mapped differently, you can use the port setting on a mapping to do that. Okay, bonus round. What if you want to do the same thing, but from an expression? Here's how you would do it. Normally, if you want to fetch the state of some input from an expression, you would write something like this. This would fetch the state of the x-axis on a joystick. Or if you wanted to fetch the state of the left mouse button, you would write something like this. Both of these would fetch the state of any device that's plugged in. For example, the second line would evaluate to 1 if the left mouse button was pressed on any of the mice that are plugged into your HID Remapper. What if we wanted to fetch the state from some particular device, similar to how we did it with the port setting on our mappings before? There's a special register that contains the currently selected port. By default, it's set to 0, meaning that we get the state from all the devices. We can set it to, say, 1 by writing something like this. Now, these two lines would only fetch inputs from the device plugged into port 1. Of course, we can set it more than once. If I add a line that says to port here, then the first input state will be fetched from the device plugged into port 1, and the second input will be fetched from the device plugged into port 2. And the port register is reset to 0 every frame before the expressions are evaluated. So if I remove the first line, then this fetches inputs from all ports, but this only fetches the inputs from port 2. Okay, that's it. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thanks for watching.